We spend a ridiculous amount of time these days talking about digital delusion, echo chambers, and fake news, right? We just assume these are purely modern problems, born from the internet. But what if I told you the absolute perfect blueprint for our modern crisis of unverified narratives was actually drafted over 400 years ago? I want you to consider your own online habits for just a second. Seriously, think about the feeds you scroll through every single day. Is your reality being subtly, or maybe not so subtly, shaped by the algorithms and the content you consume? Are you trapped in your own proprietary information bubble?
Because, and this is kind of mind-blowing, the exact same psychological feedback loops we associate with modern digital radicalization were actually diagnosed way back in 1605. We are talking about the foundational prototype of the modern Western novel, Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes.
Let's start with Section 1, the Spanish Imperial Hangover.
To really get this, we have to travel back to the sharp abyss of the 17th century Spanish Golden Age. Imagine the massive disconnect here. On one side, you have the soaring idealism of a global superpower. There's a colossal influx of American gold that's completely subsidizing elite art, painting, and theater. But on the exact same streets, raw economic decay. The domestic economy has suffered a severe structural collapse, leaving the baseline populace dealing with grinding hyperinflation and crushing taxes.
So how did ordinary people cope with this grim macroeconomic reality? Well, even though armored medieval knights had become entirely obsolete on the modern battlefield, thanks to gunpowder and professional infantry, the impoverished public obsessively consumed outdated chivalric romances. They used this totally alienating nostalgia as an escapist hedge against their miserable everyday lives. It was literally the 17th century equivalent of doom scrolling.
Moving right along to Section 2, the architect of parody.
Now you might think Cervantes was writing from some cushy ivory tower, but his timeline reveals a life defined by systemic struggle and operational failure. He fought in the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where he permanently lost the use of his left hand. By 1575, he's captured by maritime pirates and spends 5 long years detained as a slave in Algiers. Later on, he's barely scraping by as a precarious tax collector and keeps landing in jail for debts. It was actually within the confines of a Seville prison cell that Cervantes took all this brutal real-world data and engineered the ultimate parody. And from that cell, he executed a radical structural disruption called polyphony. So what does that mean? Polyphony is basically the strategic coexistence of multiple unaligned worldviews and ongoing internal debates. Before this, traditional epics were very one-dimensional and single-voiced. Cervantes entirely disrupted that architecture, forcing his readers to question reality by presenting multiple, conflicting perspectives at the exact same time. He permanently changed the modern novel.
All right, let's jump to Section 3, Delusion and Real-World Data.
Let's actually track our protagonist's descent into madness like a data trend. Alonso Quixano, an impoverished noble, undergoes continuous cognitive overload. He's consuming these outdated romances day and night without interruption. This leads to severe sleep deprivation, which effectively dehydrates his analytical faculties and triggers a complete systemic loss of reason. What's the result? He completely rebrands his identity as Don Quixote, outfitting himself in rusted family hardware to single-handedly resurrect the defunct order of knights.
To make this rogue paradigm work, Quixote literally has to build his own echo chamber. He rebrands an emaciated nag of a horse into a majestic warhorse named Rocinante. He proclaims an illiterate peasant woman to be his refined premium muse, Dulcinea. And crucially, he recruits his neighbor, Sancho Panza, as his squire by offering him the impossible, high-incentive promise of his own island asset. He's outfitting his entire operation with fabricated data. And as you'd expect, this creates a hilarious but honestly tragic clash of realities. Quixote is filtering all raw empirical metrics through his proprietary, outdated mythic codes. He sees modern windmills, but to him, they are apex predatory giants. Low-tier roadside inns become heavily fortified castles. Ordinary flocks of sheep are processed as massive armies of pagan emperors. A local barber's brass basin is instantly identified as a legendary magical helmet. The whole time, Sancho acts as the voice of real-world data, constantly flashing warning signs to his master, but it's Sancho who routinely suffers the operational blowback.
Which brings us to Section 4, the mutual contamination.
Because over time, spending your life in someone else's reality permanently alters your own.
By the time the second volume was published in 1615, Don Quixote undergoes this highly modern meta-experience. His proprietary adventures have basically scaled globally. He discovers he's now a famous literary brand. But this viral fame makes him the target of elaborate, cynical pranks by bored, ultra-wealthy elites who just manipulate his delusions for their own entertainment.
This is where the psychological engine of the story really kicks into gear. The two protagonists undergo a mutual behavioral alignment. We get centrification, where Don Quixote slowly absorbs Sancho's cold, pragmatic survival instincts and street-level malice. But simultaneously, we see quixotization as Sancho Panza falls deeply in love with his master's noble, poetic metrics. He actually starts filtering the real world through chivalric lenses. They completely cross-contaminate each other's perspectives.
But eventually, the illusion shatters. The tragic structural loop closes when Quixote is defeated by a covert hometown ally executing a brutal intervention in disguise. Quixote is legally bound to divest from his weapons and return to headquarters. On his deathbed, enforced sanity finally takes hold. He reclaims his analytical faculties, rejects the delusions, and dies as Alonso Quixote. But here is the real tragedy. Sancho Panza, now completely Quixotized, is left desperately begging his master to rearm and launch a new campaign to keep the dream alive.
And finally, Section 5, Echo Chambers and Quixoticism.
So what exactly is quixoticism? It's basically the pursuit of the impossible metric. It's when an individual champions highly romanticized, noble macro objectives against a totally pragmatic and hostile market landscape, consciously accepting the risk of appearing completely insane to baseline society. And it turns out this 17th century concept is the absolute perfect diagnostic tool for the modern individual, dismantled by obsessive media consumption.
Just look at the quixotic syndrome in the 21st century. Today, we see people trapped within proprietary information bubbles engineered by social media algorithms. Users are systematically dismantled by unverified narratives, and then they venture out into the public square, literally attacking ideological windmills. They've become totally incapable of cross-referencing their deeply held positions with the cold empirical facts of physical reality. The online conspiracy frameworks we see today mimic the exact psychological feedback loops of quixotic madness.
Which brings me to a final, provocative thought. I want you to genuinely ask yourself, are you fighting giants or are you just tilting at ideological windmills? It's incredibly tough to check our own biases when the algorithms actively want to keep us in our armor. So keep questioning your sources and please stay tethered to reality. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.